So those 10 habitat or 10 condition scores we had a look at, again, not really surprising. Those unused road reserves that were next to or connecting with a remnant had fewer weeds, more natives and more recruitment. It's this one that started this sort of interest ringing about, this neighbourhood score, because when you score neighbourhood, you stand there and you assess the vegetation in a 100-metre circle around yourself, then you do it at a kilometre and you do it at 5 kilometres, usually back at the office on the maps. And this was coming up as significant. So we thought, well, what happens in the roadsides then? Does that pattern okay, so that's the unused road reserve. So when we looked at that closer, that was that 100-metre distance that was coming up as statistically significant. Again, suggesting that small-scale management of those road reserves is really important, and they can persist and be in good condition despite the lack of vegetation at the kilometre and the 5 kilometre scale. So what was happening with the understory? When we went back and looked at the species lists, we found a correlation between if you've got a good healthy tree and you've got a lot of diversity and cover in your understory. Almost 3 times the number of understory species in under a good healthy red gum as compared to a really poor tree. We had a look at fenced and unfenced. Now, of course, the role of the experiment wasn't to look at fenced and unfenced, so we didn't know what was out there, and we came up with 3 fenced ones. I'd like to repeat this and go back and look at a larger number, because I know that's not a fantastic comparison, and I don't have data on time since fencing, so that would be another significant thing. But again, 3 times the number, so we feel that, you know, the fencing is clearly having an effect in the landscape. Now, the pattern then was repeated when we looked at the roadside data. Again, once again, it was this one that was the statistically significant one. So once again, on a roadside, you can probably have a decent corridor vegetation if you've got over 30% cover and some kind of diversity. So we then thought, well, what's missing out of that diversity? What's missing? Now, in Victoria, all ecological vegetation classes, which are the same as EECs or TECs, have been benchmarked. So we have something to compare them with. A benchmark is what you'd expect to find in a really good, mature, undisturbed woodland. So for plains grassy woodland, Gippsland red gum grassy woodland, you'd expect to find, if you just focus on the numbers in red, you'd expect to find 10 medium herbs. Now, in those 3 fenced road reserves, there was about half of those. In the other unfenced ones and on the roadsides, less than 1. Again, with the medium tufted graminoids, so that's your dianellas, your lomandras, your grasses, you'd expect to find 9 in a really good condition, 3 on the fenced areas, less than 1 again on the unfenced and the roadsides. So these ones are the ones that are particularly dropping out of those unhealthy areas, and that's just a picture of some of the ones that are missing. Now, when we looked at the list for shrubs, because there wasn't such a strong pattern with the shrubs that were missing, we found another thing of interest. On the roadsides, what's happening is, because they've mostly never been grazed, there are species that are persisting there that have simply dropped out of the grazed landscape. So they're really important reservoirs of biodiversity. So we've got cherry ballart, which is Exocarpus, we've got tree violet, which is Hymenantha or Melicitus, and she oak Alocasuarina. And these are all persisting on our roadsides but have vanished from farmscapes. Now, this one is a particularly interesting species because, you know, in the literature you look and you see, right, okay, fruit's eaten by 20 birds, it's flowering at a time where very little else is flowering. People are saying we should be putting it into shelter belts, we should be putting it back into the farm. This plant is a semi-obligate parasite. It's incredibly difficult to grow, and I can guarantee you that it hasn't been grown successfully in our area by anybody, except for one nurseryman who's not telling us how he does it. But we don't really need to know, we just need him to grow the plants for us. And then we'll get them back into that landscape. Very attractive tree, there'll probably be quite a desire to get it back in. Some other patterns that appeared from those linear remnants. Black wattles seem to be dropping out, found at only one of the 15 unfenced reserves, and some probably correspondence to canopy health. Black wattles, of course, very highly prone to grazing, and they drop out very quickly. Sweet Brassiaria again is another one. Now, Sweet Brassiaria and Tree Violet, they're both very spiny shrubs. And if you are at a land care meeting and you show these plants and you say these are what you should be putting back in, farmers say, "Oh, I hate them. They're really prickly. I hate having to, handle them." And so there's a real social kind of, important influence on what you put back into your landscape. They also hate black wattles because black wattles are relatively short-lived and they fall over on their fences. Now, once they find out that if you want sugar gliders in your landscape, you need three things. You need black wattles, you need apple gum, and you need red gum. Apple box and red gum. Apple box is Eucalyptus bridgesiana. They kind of changed their minds because they didn't realise it was quite so important in the landscape. Black wattle is the only wattle that produces a non-soluble, water-soluble gum, and the sugar gliders eat this over winter. It keeps them going over winter. We also tell them if you're going to put it in a linear remnant, stick it in the middle, make your remnant wide. If it falls over, it doesn't affect your fence, and they're happy. Mm-hmm. So in general, this is what we found from those two studies on our linear remnants. They're, the ones with the worst canopy dieback have very little underneath them, and they've got very low diversity, and we've got some key shrub and herb species that are missing. Now, what might be happening? What's happening with the dieback in these linear remnants, and what services might these plants be providing? Well, again, we don't have any of our own data, but the literature seems to suggest that what happens is these parasitic insects rely on those plants for nectar. They're very weak flyers. They tend to not go more than 100 to 200 metres away from their food source. If you've got those plants under your tree, you've got these insects under your tree, and these insects parasitize the leaf-eating insects that are up there. So that's I gave this talk at I gave this talk at a Land Care Network meeting, and immediately they changed their plant order from shrubs and trees to half of the graminoids and the grasses. So fantastic. That's what CMNs are about, getting that information out there quickly so people can respond. Now, weeds and linear remnants, that's going to be our nightmare. Look, most of them have really problematic weeds that are really difficult to manage. Woody weeds like blackberry and boxthorn, perennial weed species. You have to be careful if you call them that, because the farmer will look at you and say it's a pasture grass, not a weed. But they're a major problem, there's no doubt about it. Now, the reason that the weeds are a problem is because of the connection with the nutrient load in that weed, in that roadside. If you've got higher nutrients under your tree, you've got higher food quality in your leaves, and you've got this self-perpetuating cycle where your young leaves have more nitrogen for the insects. The insects use proline, one of the amino acids in the leaf, to power their flight muscles. The younger leaves under a stress tree, which a stress tree is producing all the time, are much higher in proline. They'll eat more, and there's been a couple of studies that have shown that that simple nutrient load in that roadside is enough to have a major effect on the insect load on the tree. Now, I couldn't figure out where the nutrients were coming on the roadsides, because some of these aren't very heavily used roadsides. Our soils are extremely prone to wind erosion, and during the drought, the soil just washes off the paddock, gets trapped in the roadside by the weeds, and the nutrient load just goes up and up. And so this is why we need really good landscape management, and we've got DPI doing great projects in our area with stock exclusion zones and drought-proof fencing and all that sort of stuff, where they're getting farmers to keep 80% cover on the paddock and get their stock off quickly and confine them and feed them and water them in the same place. And this is going to have a big impact on our endangered woodland communities. So can they be restored? Well, yes, probably, but only if there's no point going in and getting your land care groups to plant those areas up, really, unless you deal with those nutrients first. And we're very interested in Suzanne Proberney and Lunt's work on sugar application, follow-up seeding with kangaroo grass, because that seems to suggest that you get this self-sustaining community. So the management recommendations that we've sort of come out with, carry on fencing remnants, make them wider. We're very interested in the scientific literature that's suggesting now 30 metres is probably the minimum that you want. You want to fence your linear remnants around large old trees to provide extra habitat for birds. We want patch planting of shrubs. We don't want these heavy shrubby areas, because this is not a shrubby woodland community, it's a grassy woodland community. We want to get those herbs and forbs back in, and we want to somehow manage the nutrient load in these linear remnants. The big threats that we've got, and these are connected, is subdivision and reservation status. Public lands keep telling us, stop fencing off our unused roads. They're roads. We need them as roads. You are not to fence them off. In desperation, one of the landholders we were working with actually bought his unused road reserve. Now that's he was charged $5,000 per hectare for the pleasure of it, for this very degraded piece of land. Now that's a good outcome when you've got a really sympathetic landowner who will then go on to put a conservation covenant, because that's a win for biodiversity. It's not such a great idea where, as Pia said, you've got reserves that might be sold off. We are losing some of our public estate when that happens. The reservation status, again, most of them you can apply for a grazing license, you can get it. You used to be able to apply for a conservation license. One person left the department. Now we can't get conservation licenses anymore. We tell people, get your grazing license so that at least you've got it. If you're a sympathetic landholder, you're not going to graze it anyway, but you've got it, and you've stopped your neighbour from getting it potentially. So the best outcome is, of course, that, and this is another patch of grassy woodland, is that it's fenced on this side, and you want it fenced and widened. I went to this landholder and I said, I'll give you full fencing costs to fence this off. No, thank you. Those trees have been in my land, on my farm, for 2 generations, and I absolutely love them. I'm not fencing them off. They are knackered. They scored 40 out of 100, and they only scored that because they've got such big old trees. There's nothing underneath them. It's got a grazing license on it. Doesn't make any sense to me. It's a no-brainer. I can't understand why they would have a grazing license on a nationally endangered grassy woodland. Some great work on strategic linkages, focusing on revegetating, restoring sites, and on focusing on those unused road reserves. And what do we need? Well, we need, as everybody needs, more money for fences. We need really good ecological restoration. What we tend to do at the moment, because we've got such limited resources, put the fence up, do some direct seeding, and hope for the best. And we need assistance with our lobbying, Paul, for that reservation status is a significant factor on ground and what happens. So, in summary, these linear reserves are extremely important in the landscape. They've got lots of large old trees. They host shrubs that are missing from the agricultural landscape, and they can be healthy and self-sustaining with good management and good policy. As Tony said, I'm